Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Our guest on the episode of this podcast is Mike Beam, the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of Kansas. Mike Beam was appointed Secretary of the Kansas Department of Agriculture by Governor Laura Kelly in January of 2019 and confirmed in April of that year. He came to KDA following 38 years of experience in association management for the Kansas Livestock Association. He began his career as a county 4-H and youth extension agent in Dickinson County, following his graduation from Kansas State University with a bachelor's degree in animal sciences in industry. Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us on the pod.
Well, I'm honored to be invited. Thank you.
Well, this is a wheat podcast, but we'd love to have you talk to us a little bit more about some goings-on in the state of agriculture and maybe give some insights to the Department of Agriculture that people may not know about. So give us that kind of elevator pitch of what KDA does for someone who might not be familiar with the broad menu of services it has.
Well, I like to tell folks when I visit with them about our agency, virtually everything we do has been directed to us by the Kansas legislature. From what we can tell, we're the first State Department of Agriculture, and since that time there in the late 1800s, there's program after program that has been tasked for the agency to do. And so if we're down a track that legislators or others feel like we shouldn't be in that field, then I often say, well, it's probably time to revisit that. We're open to discussion because we want to do what the public, what the agricultural community, and what legislators want us to do. I think our biggest challenge is doing it, how we do it, and doing it right. So, naturally, a lot of people think of it as a regulatory front that we're working on, and it is, but we also attempt to do that in a way that has a strong educational bent and awareness. And actually, some of the things that we do in that space is imperative for businesses to operate. And the one example would be our small, medium-sized meat and poultry operations that have chosen not to go federal. And many of those are doing more than custom slaughter. And so before they can even operate, they have to have an inspector there. And if we can't make it, they really aren't supposed to go ahead and start processing. So we've got our folks out throughout the state, and I suppose if it's a really bad blizzard or something to that effect, or the person's employees couldn't even make it, that we may not get there. If we're having illness, we have people in other parts of the state. So we've got to be there for continuity of operation. Another thing that comes to mind is kind of consumer safety. If you ever look at a gas pump when you fill your tank, somewhere on that pump should be a sticker that has Kansas Department of Agriculture, and that sticker will tell you when that pump was last inspected. And we are to try to get there at least once every 18 months to all the fuel pumps across the state of Kansas, try to verify that it's accurate in the quantity that's pumped. And on occasion, we'll check the quality of fuel. We'll get complaints sometimes, usually in the winter. Maybe somebody thought they had a little bit of water in their fuel. So we can go check that out. And then scales, all the scales.
Yeah.
We don't inspect every one, but our role is to make sure they're all inspected by private companies. And so there's a lot of consumer protectionism. It seems like there's more and more focus on pesticide and fertilizer application. And this program, like others, we have an agreement with the federal counterparts to do it. And, of course, you have to meet their guidelines and expectations. And on occasion, they'll provide some of the funding resources for it. But with all of the changes in the use of pesticides and what, unfortunately, is coming in the future with extra label requirements to meet endangered species law requirements, we handle a lot of complaints. We have the pesticide drift complaint season that I think is kind of wrapping up. So we're in the field doing tests, visiting with growers, doing surveys. If we have a complaint, we'll go around to the neighborhood and try to determine what was applied, when it was applied. We don't determine if somebody really harmed another crop. We just simply determine if the application adhered to the label. And that could be, wind speed, the date, and some of those other very important factors. So I can go through a whole list.
Well, how many different departments or programs are there within the Kansas Department of Agriculture itself?
At least 8.
8.
The 2 programs that have the largest number of employees. This will surprise a lot of people, but we do food safety. So every restaurant, food service, they have a license from us, and we go in. We try to get there at least annually and respond to all complaints. So that's a pretty big team. The legislature took that from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment and moved it to the Department of Ag, probably 20 years ago, 15 anyway. And I was surprised as I got acquainted with my peers in other states that there are quite a few states that have the food safety aspect. I'm kind of proud of our team because we have the state fair that's going on, and before the fair starts, our folks are down there. They check with every food vendor, make sure they're doing things correctly and got the right protocols in place, and then respond to any complaints. The second largest in number is water, Division of Water Resources.
Sure.
And we don't really deal or address water quality per se, other than chemigation. But all of your water applications, permits, the permit to do a structure, all of that is handled through our agency, and we actually have field offices across the state to help with that. That can be somewhat contentious, a lot of pressure, a lot of applications, maybe change the point of use. Surprise to me was how many applications we have in the eastern half of the state. That there seems to be a lot of interest and push to, build small dams and start creating your own source of water for irrigation from surface water. And so that takes a lot of consideration, if the structure is going to be built correctly. Is it going to impact somebody's water downstream?
Mm-hmm.
Because even though they may not have a piece of paper that says they have a permit, but if you have a domestic well or a small livestock well or a stock water pond that's been there for a while, you have the right to force the seniority of that in case somebody else wants upstream or up the watershed wants to divert that. So we deal with a lot of those. But waters, as we all know, it's a big issue. It varies. It's a very important issue. If you look at the economic engine of our state, largely depends upon water, and a lot of that is groundwater through the aquifer.
I think it's dynamic, and I bet you most people weren't aware of the food safety component of it. There's always dynamics on what's Kansas Department of Agriculture, what's federal government. Like, for example, there's a Kansas Grain Warehouse Division and a federal warehouse division, and services that KDA provides as dictated by the legislature. Kansas Department of Agriculture collects the wheat checkoff. That's defined in the law too. But how many of those things that your department does are on behalf of a federal government program?
Probably more than half.
Really?
Theoretically, we could close down meat and poultry, pesticide. I don't know if we could get away with food safety, but a lot of these programs, grain warehouse is an example. We could close those down and say, hey, everybody, if you're going to have to be licensed and fall under the federal requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And the legislature and growers and the public, and most of them would rather deal with the state that's closer to home.
Mm-hmm.
But there's certain limitations. We've got to adhere to the federal requirements overall. We have some flexibility. So all those are memorandums of agreements or understanding with our federal counterpart, whether it be USDA or Food and Drug Administration or EPA or others. As I said, a lot of it's been dependent upon what the legislature and the general public and the community have felt like, who they wanted to have the oversight.
And funding is multi-directional too, I suppose. There's general funds from the state of Kansas and fee-funded and grants from the federal government.
Correct.
Is that everything?
Exactly. The source of funding that we get from the state through state general fund is the smallest portion.
Mm-hmm.
We get a lot of fees from the various sectors, whether it be even animal health, water, pesticide, and other programs. Most of them have a fee attached, and sometimes the legislature said you should fund this 100% with fees, or we want to provide some state funds. The food safety is 100% fees. So we're pretty small, probably around $11 million in state general fund, which is, it's probably about 15% of our budget comes from the state general fund.
Yeah. How many employees in the department overall?
We're around 325.
Okay.
About half of those are headquartered in our office in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the beauty of it, is we have a lot of employees that work in very remote rural communities and work from home, because if they're in the field, whether it be grain warehouses, meat and poultry, food safety, we need people in all parts of the state. So they work from home. They maybe get into the office every 2 months or so. It's kind of interesting. We find a lot of people in these rural communities that don't have a lot of opportunities for jobs, provide benefits like we do. We don't pay the best compared to some industry, but it's a pretty good opportunity to be a part of the state and be a part of agriculture and work in these very remote rural areas.
Yeah, important. So there's this service part of it, but there's also so much more that KDA does in terms of, representing Kansas agriculture, that marketing part of it, the research, the trade promotion. Tell us some of the priorities in that area or some of the programs that you're most proud of.
Well, yes. Again, I found it interesting that the legislature actually has a statement in there that part of the key role of the Kansas Department of Agriculture is to promote Kansas agriculture, both within the state but also internationally. So we focus on that. A lot of it comes under our division of marketing. So we have some focus on international markets. We've got a couple people that have quite a bit of experience and knowledge, and that's usually working very closely with USDA's international marketing efforts and very closely with the private sector who's wanting to grow or look at opportunities internationally. So we'll have some trade missions. Again, that's the beauty of having this federal connection, because USDA has been putting a lot of resources towards trade. And we've been able to access those and work on basically getting to know that market and trying to introduce our stakeholders to it as we learn more about it. The one area I think that's grown quite a bit in the last 4 or 5 years is some people call it local food or specialty crops. And it really took off after, well, I shouldn't say after COVID, actually during COVID. And as people went to the store, they found that the shelves started to become empty. Nobody starved, but you may not have 3 or 4 choices, and you may have to limit the amount that you purchase there for a few weeks. But there seems to be a lot more interest in growing local food, more farmers markets. And actually we had some people in that business, but it's amazing to me to see how much it's grown. I mean, they like others have to have extra help, and they struggle, finding workforce. They've got just a certain window to market, to harvest and market those products, and they have to be very creative. But we've got several big grants that have come through. We just had, $5 million come through from the Resilient Food Systems, and we've been able to award that to 40-some people across the state who are going to be able to use for purchasing equipment, refrigeration, transportation.
Was local meat processing a big part of that?
It wasn't this one. Ironically, this program says that would be prohibitive. And the only reason it was prohibited in this grant program, there was a previous federal grant that was focused just on meat. And we had a few people access that. But there were some federal dollars that came in the summer of 2020, and the states received. And the Department of Agriculture was able to access about $16 million of that. So there, in the course of about 3 months, our marketing staff took applications and processed those and got the money out the door for lots of grants. Not just specialty crop, but there were some people getting involved in direct sales of meat. There's a big help to our small meat processing. We were able to help local rural grocery stores with some refrigeration. So there was a lot of opportunities, and people really benefited from that. And I'm really proud of our team who they were already busy doing some other things, but this grant come along and, they just worked hard, worked the overtime, worked the weekends, into the holidays of 2020 to get that money out. And it's really helped some small businesses, and that being farms who are trying to also market some direct.
Yeah, let's circle back to the spring of 2019, huh? You were confirmed in April, and what else was going on at that time? First day on the job, you got COVID to deal with, basically.
Well, it was actually a year later.
That was a year later.
Yeah, so I had a full year, but, at that time, you heard the term drinking from fire hose. I think there's 2 fire hoses. That first 3 or 4 months, I had no idea. We were going in the legislature, working on our budget. I was trying to meet with all of our programs. A lot of our stakeholders were trying to get familiar. But just as we thought we were starting to get our feet on the ground, then came late February, March of 2020. It's part of our, even though the state and most states and federal entities, shut down being directly accessible, but we had our folks in the field that were continuing to operate just as they were, trying to do some social distancing. But again, there was big demand for local food, and some of those, particularly meat and poultry, had to be there to inspect it. So it was a little odd that some of their peers in other parts of our agency and other employees across the state, all of a sudden they were working from home, and then they were actually, nothing changed for them other than they had more duties, more facilities, more pressure. So it was quite a change. But we went through that period. It seems like it really, from a food standpoint, it really heightened about Palm Sunday weekend through Easter and into May. We were watching these meat processing plants in other states close down, at least some temporarily, or close their shifts. And, we have such a big presence here, where about 25% of the nation's fed cattle are processed here in the plants in Kansas. So we were having multiple conversations with them a day. Some of their employees wouldn't show up. Most of them wanted to continue to work. I was really proud of the way the state as a whole, because we were having conversations with the Department of Health and Environment, because they were, regulating this in many degrees, with the administration, with federal counterparts, the private sector. And gosh, there wasn't a plant that shut down. Mm-hmm. Until later in the spring, there was a plant. It was a pork sausage plant that shut down for about a week or so. But it was scary, because those animals there's a time frame for them to go to slaughter, and if they don't, they get overweight, and then the next one's coming behind them, and so you get quite a bottleneck. But we worked through it. It was pretty scary there for several weeks, but I was really surprised and grateful for the patience that we had from our producers. They understood. It helped, to communicate, so they knew that we were on top of it. But it was a time frame that I will never forget.
Yeah,
it was pretty stressful.
That has to be a point of pride, keeping those food supply chains open here in Kansas that affected the rest of the country. How has COVID changed agriculture in Kansas, do you think, for better or for worse?
Actually, we just had our growth summit, mm-hmm. and there had to be at least 2 people that said there's some positive things that happened in agriculture because of COVID that probably wouldn't happen otherwise. And I thought, when I heard that, if you'd have said something about that, made that projection in the spring of 2020, people would have thought you were pretty calloused. But it has. I mean, it's raised awareness of where food comes from. It's allowed Kansans who want to get involved in selling direct opportunities. The biggest challenge has been labor. I mean, it's still, a lot of people didn't come back into the workforce, and we're seeing challenges just like every industry is. So otherwise, in some cases, it's been a positive economic aspect to agriculture.
Well, let's talk about Kansas agriculture standing on the world stage. You do a lot of trade missions within your department, promoting Kansas products overseas, having those people come here, obviously large producer and exporter in beef and wheat and many other things. Where does Kansas fit on the radar in the globe? Are people aware of Kansas agriculture as one of the leading ag producers in the world?
I believe so. From my limited experience, the last number I saw, I think the value of ag exports by state, I think we come in about 7th, and that's about where we come in on total value of ag production. We were 5th. A couple states moved ahead of us. We were 5th with the 2017 ag census. We dropped to 7th in 2022, even though our value went up considerably. But I believe it's Illinois and Minnesota jumped ahead of us. And that has largely to do with value of commodities. But export, it's a very important part, and I'm going to ask our economists and others to try to put together a report on the value of ag exports on each of our sectors. I know, and the only reason I can say this is the pork industry told me a few weeks ago, but about 40% of their production is export. And I know wheat is significant.
Right.
And beef is significant from a dollar value. And that's the interesting thing on the meat side is what's a valuable export are products that we don't really consume here in the United States. The variety meats are in demand. So it really adds value. And so we're so dependent upon it. And I really believe that if you looked at various sectors of the economy, agricultural producers probably follow international politics and international trade more than other sectors because it's a big business. It's a big part of it. It seems like the buzzword I hear now is we got to continue to take care of those trading partners and try to be in the game and getting additional or renewed trade agreements. And we need to diversify, and I'm a big believer in that because if we put all of our eggs in one or two baskets as far as countries we export to, with the status of geopolitics, you're at a big risk. So if we can diversify, I think that's just a good risk management tool for our markets.
Yeah, this current administration has brought some really big businesses to the state of Kansas, and there's been some very large in the dairy industry, been some big boosts, and we circle back to the ag employment issue, that struggle just finding good help in the state. What can the Kansas Department of Agriculture do to focus on that issue?
Well, we ask ourselves that question almost daily. First, let me respond to that. That's been a positive aspect of some of those value-added ventures. You can just tick off, the cheese plant, the wheat milling and biofuel plant, the soybean crushing facilities. There's others. The continued growth of pet food. Pet food is our 5th largest sector. Right. So it's using grain and meat products, and they're also seeking additional exports. So I think we can do small things, education, awareness. We have to get people involved in agriculture, primarily from a youth standpoint, who have never really thought about pursuing a career in agriculture. We don't have enough of us Aggies out there.
They don't all come from the farm anymore. Yeah.
And it's an opportunity, really, because some of the really best employees that I hear about are ones who were basically mentored, brought in, and they found out, hey, this is my niche, I enjoy it, and make a huge contribution to the ag sectors. So first of all, we got to recognize that there are people that would be good employees, good stakeholders, good businesses, if you think about technology. So we got to reach out and think broader about the potential employees or people that want to pursue this career. And that could be done with our universities, our community colleges, and our technical schools, and even individual farmers. In these rural communities, we know there are youth there who probably think that the only people that can really work on a farm or pursue an agriculture career are those involved in it now, and that's just not true if we open up our arms and bring those in. I think continuing to give support for ag education at the high school level will be helpful, and I've been encouraged that we've got as many chapters now as we've had for many years. I think probably the only thing limiting the growth in ag education FFA is teaching, so we need more ag teachers. So that helps. And again, that helps reach those who are non-traditional agricultural kids to get engaged. Housing is an issue. If you look at communities who, maybe have a new value-added processing or even production farms and ranches who are trying to grow, and they may have access or know of people who want to work there, but they may not have the ability to live there. So I know the states is trying to help with tax incentives and other efforts to create more housing. That needs to happen everywhere, but if we can at least give some support or encouragement for those funds to go in some of those rural communities, that will help. So it's, one person said it's kind of a shotgun approach. You want to be very strategic, but if you focus on one thing, you're going to miss the opportunity.
Speaking of ag education, I imagine you spend a lot of time in the State House. Just like most rural states, our legislature is becoming more urban and less rural. How much of a role can a department like KDA play in bridging that knowledge gap and keeping agriculture at the forefront of our legislators?
Well, I think we can play an important role. And I also think our agricultural organizations that have a presence in the Capitol play a vital role in that. I think back of whenever we go to the legislature, if we have a bill dealing with pesticides, if there's a commodity checkoff bill, our budget, when you look at all these programs, we're talking to legislators about what we do, and they have no clue about not just our agency, but our agriculture. So sometimes I tell our folks that are there every day, said you got to think back and give some context and don't use too many acronyms, and remember that, unfortunately, I think almost all legislators want to know more. And I think they understand the economic contribution agriculture makes to the state. And we don't want to patronize them. We want to, because most of them are business people. They understand the basics. So it's an opportunity when we're dealing with our budget, we're dealing with issues affecting our agency, or working with other ag organizations on the private sector on legislation. It's a good opportunity to step back a little bit and talk about that sector or agriculture, and also talk about the economic contributions that maybe even that individual sector makes.
Yeah, I imagine you're a very important wealth of resources for that. I was thinking about it. I had not. You referenced earlier that KDA was the first Department of Agriculture in the U.S.?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
My peers have not been able to prove me wrong yet.
Yeah, well, you do have a group of peers, of different state Department of Agricultures. Is there anything you've learned from other state Department of Agricultures that might surprise us? Are there some that are just completely different than what we would consider the traditional or make Kansas different?
This is the pleasant surprise. I didn't know there was that much coordination or collaboration. And there's a National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. We get together twice a year. We have Zoom calls monthly, and then there's our regional Midwest, and we get together more often than that. And that has been very helpful. If there's an issue, if we have an issue with a program where, let's say, pesticide, most state departments of ag are the ones who do the regulation that under the guidelines of EPA. And if we've got issues, we can collectively say, we can get together and collectively say, if you really want to make a difference, you need to do these three things, or this is not going to work. And actually, I've developed some good friendships with my peers in other states. Can't get too attached because most of those are appointed by the governors, but a good deal of them are elected from the people in their state.
Really?
So, yeah, you'd be surprised. There's some turnover every 2 or 4 years, but since I've had the privilege of being there 5.5 years, I've got to know some of them really well. And we had this HPAI, avian influenza issue that was affecting some of these states around us initially. I was able to talk to the states around me, and we were kind of comparing notes. And so it's really helpful, and it's been one of the most pleasant parts of my job, actually.
Mike, let's talk wheat here a little bit and kind of finish up in the context of water being an issue. Obviously, in Kansas, we're all aware of that, and Kansas being the wheat state. What do you think are some future opportunities and challenges from farmers who grow wheat? What do they need to know about Mike Beam, the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and the vision of the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, first let me say that, I'm old enough and grew up on our family's farm, and wheat was the major crop. I mean, we were wheat, sorghum, fallow rotation. And when it came to wheat planting and wheat harvest, that's crunch time. It's important time. And, it's planted in significant amounts all throughout the state. So it's kind of, from a nostalgic part, I hate to see, the drop-off of that. But it's such a perfect crop for our state. Based on our climate, soils, we've proven, that we can grow wheat better than any state. I would guess that our location right in the middle of the United States has hurt us a little bit on economic advantage on exports. So if we can do some areas of, working to support strategic rail. Also on the ports, we can help on the transportation, not just from an export standpoint internationally, but export to other states. I was disheartened to hear this spring, and nobody's proved me wrong, but this economist said that the United States, not Kansas, the United States grows 8% of the world's wheat. And that just floored me. So we've done a good job of teaching others how to grow wheat, but we do it better than anybody. So I really think if we can collectively do things to add value to wheat, it's going to have its advantages as we reduce water use. If we can think of it maybe even an enhanced value-added cover crop, continue to focus on varieties and genetics. But, I'm still bullish about wheat because it's for Kansas, some of our adjoining states as well. But I think there's an opportunity, but we've just got to be aware that other countries are doing it as well. We just got to do it better and keep investing in the genetics and the technology to continue to make it viable.
That's a great place to wrap up. Mike, thanks for those comments. Appreciate your input and everything you do for the state of Kansas. My thanks to Mike Beam, the Secretary of Agriculture for the state of Kansas, for being on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. Remember, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for our guest, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.